All right, last couple of weeks we've been looking at the prophets. Last week we looked at the prophet Micah and addressed the core question: how are we to live? What does God want from us? And Micah said it's simple, three things. He says we do justice, we love mercy, we walk humbly with God. He says this is what God wants from us. Well, today we're going to look at a contemporary of Micah, who had many ways his message was very similar to Micah's message, the prophet we know as Isaiah. But as usual, I find historical context is very helpful. And so we're going to backtrack from Isaiah about 200 years before Isaiah to understand why he was there and why he said the things that he did. 200 years before Isaiah, King Solomon died. And when King Solomon died, the nation splits apart and civil war breaks out. And there's no unification. The war divides the people, and the fighting continues for generations. The result is, instead of having one nation, now there are two smaller nations. One takes the name Israel. The other one goes by the name Judah. Now, each of them have their own kings, their own places of worship, their own capital cities. They become separate countries. And over the next several hundred years, there are 39 different kings. All right. So I know you can't read all that or look at that, but it shows all these different kings and the prophets. Some of the kings only reign for like 7 days. Some of them for decades. But what I wanted you to see on here is it's a color coding kind of thing. And according to 1 Kings and Chronicles, they rated the kings on whether they followed God or didn't follow God. And so you have a color code from righteous being green to red being out and out evil. All right, and then everything in between. And so as you look at that, you can see the northern kingdom, there's no green at all in that, all right? So none of them were on the good side. It was from medium bad to bad, all right, kings that you had. Judah had some in the green, although there were others as well, but at least some of them were good. So the other names in there, the ones in the blue, these are the prophets who were sent to come talk to the kings to help bring them back, to help guide them into how God wanted them to live. So if we're going to focus on Isaiah, we're going to just focus on in here to a time where there was one of the worst kings and then one of the best kings. And they were father-son duo here. And Isaiah comes and speaks to them. Now Ahaz is the king we want to talk about first, where Isaiah begins his ministry. He was a king of Judah, the southern kingdom there, but he was under pressure, right? Because he said Israel and Aram, the next country up, had formed alliance, and they were attacking Judah. They would come and they would put raids in Judah. They would take people prisoner. They would plunder their towns, and they weren't strong enough to conquer Judah, but they were strong enough to be a nuisance all the time. So Ahaz says, I can't get rid of them on my own. Where am I going to go? Well, you had two choices if you wanted help, and you lived in that part of the world at that time. There were two superpowers that they were sort of stuck between. You had Egypt to the south, and you had Assyria to the north. And so the King Ahaz sort of went both ways. He went to the Egyptians and said, I need your help with this. But he didn't want the Egyptians tromping through his country because they might not leave. And so he also makes a deal with the Assyrians. He says, now the Syrians, I want you to come down. Would you mind? I'd love it if you would attack Israel and Aram, and I'll help you with that. Just help get rid of my neighbors. And if you do that, I'll be your loyal subject, and everything else like that. He also said to Egypt, he said, the Syrians are coming down, but in case they don't stop, would you also help me and be my ally? So he was playing both ends there. So anyway, the Syrians were busy expanding their kingdom in all different directions, and so they were glad to have invitation to come on down, and they do that. They destroy Aram, they destroy Israel, and they're completely gone. We talk about the lost tribes of Israel. 10 of the 12 tribes are utterly destroyed. They never come back again. Ahaz is pleased to have his enemies gone, and so he adopts the gods of Assyria. He dismantles the temple, gets rid of the priests. He gets plans on how to build Assyrian altars and builds them all over Judah. So things are dark days for the people of God in Judah. Fortunately, Ahaz dies. Fortunate for Judah, not for him. And his son, King Hezekiah, then takes the throne. And Hezekiah comes and he tears down all these Assyrian altars. He reopens the temple in Jerusalem. He brings the priests back. He starts observing Passover again and the religious holidays. Now, the Syrians are not too crazy about this because Ahaz had been their puppet. He gave them their allegiance. And they didn't like having someone on the throne whose allegiance was to God, not to them. So they decide they need to take out Hezekiah. And so they send their army down to talk with him. But sending the whole army is a lot of work. Jerusalem is a difficult city to conquer. It's in a mountainous area. It's well defended, and it takes a lot of work. You have to bring in all the earthworks and all the laying siege. Can take years to conquer a city like Jerusalem. So instead of doing that, they send a messenger down to threaten the people. The Assyrians know if you want to conquer someone, it's easier to conquer them if they're afraid and divided instead of a united front. Some people defending their homeland can fight tooth and nail because they're defending that which they love dearly. But if you can sow discord among the people and distrust among the people and tell them lies and question their ability to defend themselves, they're a much weaker target. So that's what the Syrians do. They send down this guy to tell them lies, to make them question whether God can even protect them, and make them gives them this offer. If you just surrender now without me having to bring all my troops down here, it'd be nicer for you. All right, we'll give you a nice place to live. We'll take care of you and do that. The Syrians knew that if you tell a lie often enough and loud enough, people believe it. And so he's out there just railing and railing and railing until the people have a hard time telling the difference between truth and non-truth. All right? So I'm going to just give you some, it's a long passage, but we're going to give you some of the highlights of what the king of Assyria comes and how he tries to create fear and distrust among the people. So from Isaiah 36, goes like this. He says, "This is what the king of Assyria says. What are you trusting in that makes you so confident? Do you think that mere words can substitute for military skill or strength? Who are you counting on that you're rebelling against me? On Egypt? If you lean on Egypt, it's like leaning on a reed that splinters beneath your weight and pierces your hand. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is completely unreliable. Perhaps you'll say to me, we're trusting in the Lord our God. But isn't he the one who was insulted by Hezekiah? Didn't Hezekiah tear down the shrines and altars and make everyone in Jerusalem and Judea worship only here at the altar in Jerusalem? So they'll tell you what, I'll strike a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses if you can find that many men to ride them. But if with your tiny army, how do you think you can challenge even the weakest contingent of my master's troops, even with the help of Egypt's chariots and charioteers? What's more, do you think we've invaded your land without the Lord's direction? The Lord himself told us, attack this land and destroy it." Well, this goes on and on and on with repeating these threats and these lies. And he finally says this. He says, "Don't let Hezekiah mislead you, saying the Lord will rescue us. Have the gods of any other nation saved the people from the king of Assyria? Did any god rescue Samaria from my power? What god of any nation has been able to save its people from my power? What makes you think the Lord can rescue Jerusalem from me?" So he lays this all out. And it sort of works. The people are filled with fear. But Hezekiah, being a good king, even though he's afraid, he knows where to turn. He turns to God. He sends for the prophet Isaiah. He says, "What does God say? I've heard what the Syrians say in their charges." And Isaiah comes and assures him, he says, "Don't worry about the Syrians. They will withdraw." And the very next day they do. Right? God strikes the army and the Syrians withdraw. The Assyrian king goes back. He is assassinated by his own sons. And then they have to go on the defense because the new rising power, Babylon, is knocking at their door. Isaiah is able to calm the fears, to say, don't listen to the lies around us. He sees a bigger picture. I want to go back to words that we find in the very beginning of Isaiah's prophecy. This is what he says. He says, in the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established as the highest of all the mountains. It shall be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many people will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob. He may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between nations and arbitrate between peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. When I read this passage, I'm reminded of the statue that stands outside the UN. It was given to the UN by the Soviet Union, right in the very heart, in the middle of the Cold War. A vision of peace, a vision of hope, where the instruments of war might be turned to better purposes. Reminds us that conflict is not inevitable, that peace is possible. The walls can come down. People of my generation grew up in the Cold War, and I don't think my kids really get that at all, what it was like to grow up with that kind of fear of godless communism, right? And one of the symbols that I grew up under was a wall in Berlin. And I couldn't imagine that this wall, it was two walls, and in between it was mines and barbed wire and all these kinds of things to separate people, that it could ever be dismantled. But yet it was. If you're under 30, you say, what wall? I don't remember any wall. So what happened? How did this wall, how did hope triumph over fear? Well, there were a lot of factors that led up to it, but people at prayer was a big part of that. I had a patch that I wore on my jacket. It came from the East Germans. It simply says swords into plowshares. It was an emblem that it uses the prophecies found both in Micah and Isaiah of God turning our swords into plowshares. This was a formative time in my life back in the 80s. I had decided I was going to become a pastor. And so I'd gone back to grad school, and I remember hearing stories about what was going on in East Germany. There were groups of people, especially in Leipzig, that gathered every day to pray. They gathered every Monday. Monday nights they gathered, started with 12 people to pray. As time grew over the years, by 7-8 years later, there were thousands of people gathering every Monday to pray. And these prayers would spill out beyond. They couldn't fit them all in the church. They'd spill out into the streets. Now, the communist leaders at the time tried to squash this movement. They barricaded the church. They arrested, they beat those who were coming. But in 1989, everything came to a head. The church called for a massive prayer vigil, right? And 8,000 people came to the cathedral. Now, the police were ready. The streets were filled with the Stasi, the secret police. They came out in full riot gear. Hospitals were all gearing up because they expected a bloodbath to happen. And said of 8,000 people, 70,000 people came to join the 8,000 who were gathered. Miraculously, the Stasi did not open fire on them. Later, they were talking to some of the guards, and they said, why wasn't there a violent response? They said, we were ready for everything they would do except candles and prayer. The next Monday, 120,000 people came to pray. The following Monday, there were 300,000 people who came to pray. And there was no turning back. 2 weeks later, the wall came down. For 28 years, these people had been divided by a wall of fear. but through prayer, they were reunited. Unfortunately, today, more of our conversation is about erecting walls than tearing them down. And it is that there's always things to fear. I mean, fear is what builds walls. And there's more than enough fear to go around. And granted, there are scary things. There are real issues that we need to deal with. But when you're fed a constant diet of fear, how do we keep from letting that consume us or giving into that? Well, we can turn like we do to Isaiah, and we pause. And we don't let the fears overwhelm us. We breathe. We pray. We reflect. Now, I realize this isn't anything new, but we claim these promises of God, and we refuse to feed the fears, right? We look for light. We reach out. We take risks. We trust. We have faith. We cling to a vision that Isaiah lifted up to us, that peace is possible. We don't have to live in fear. We don't have to give in to conflict. We commit ourselves to work for that, for our children, for our grandchildren, that we do not let fear win the day. I think this is why my favorite season of the year is Advent, because it's all about hope in the midst of fear. I think I've probably mentioned this other years. I'm a big advocate for an earlier Advent. I think if we wait till after Thanksgiving to start Advent, we've already lost. All right. By after Thanksgiving, you have a whole month of Christmas. Advent is supposed to be a time we prepare for that. So I always start my Advent right about now. I need a couple weeks before Thanksgiving and all the shopping and all the stuff that happens to get my mind ready to hear the voice, to turn to the prophets, to hear their voice. So this morning we're going to be just real radical here. We're going to sing an Advent hymn. Even though it's not officially Advent, so don't tell the bishop and everything like that. But we're we're having Advent already here at Joy Lutheran. But we need a song of hope in the face of fear. So invite Joan, why don't you come back up here? Let's sing a good Advent hymn. It's called "Comfort, Comfort Now, My People." Let's